And hello, everyone, and thank you, Anna, very much for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining me today to discuss mental health and UX research. As it was already mentioned, I'm here today to share some tips and tricks along with strategies that have worked well for me. You'll actually find a mix of advice, some heartfelt, others seemingly smaller, but I would say still important. As an example, I initially planned for a mild and professional color scheme using shades of beige for the presentation. But as I spent time on it, I realized it wasn't really sparking joy for me. So I changed it to something more vibrant. And surprisingly, even this small tweak gave me a motivational boost to work on it. So I hope this session will similarly spark something within you. And now that you're familiar with my current favorite colors, and you will see them throughout the presentation, let me share something more substantial about myself. So as you know, my name is Dominika. I'm a UX researcher currently at Content.ai, which is a headless content management system that helps organizations manage content for better user experiences. I studied sociology and behavioral sciences, which led me to work in the nonprofit sector. There I was not only a researcher, but I also held the role of diversity and inclusion specialist and even worked as a field worker. So transitioning to UX research was a big career shift, but as it was already mentioned, my ongoing interest in mental health stayed strong because I believe it is intertwined with all aspects of life. I'm also really interested in user experience and understanding how people behave. I'm especially curious about how user experience and mental health come together. Outside of work, I would say that I seek inspiration in art galleries. I indulge in people watching quite a lot. I'm also a proud cat mom of a ginger cat who reminds me to be mindful in my daily life. That actually sounds like my tip number one, get a cat, but depends on you. So that's a bit about myself. And next thing I would like to mention before I really start, or before we dive into the discussion on self-care, I actually want to acknowledge that while self-care strategies can be beneficial for many, they are often not a substitute for professional help. So if you or someone you know is dealing with serious mental health issues, it's important to seek support from qualified professionals. If you require immediate assistance or know someone who does, please consider reaching out to helplines such as these. And given that September is Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month, I find it super important to mention this. So I just wanted to do that. So before I begin sharing the promised self-care tips and tricks, I'm going to present to you why I think we should prioritize the mental well-being of all UX researchers. I intentionally stress all UX researchers because I believe that self-care is relevant to all of us. Additionally, I think it isn't like solely relevant to those working on emotionally taxing topics, such as healthcare, for example, which I believe should include regular supervisory support. I think it extends to every UX researcher who might not immediately recognize that the products they work on can actually induce stress in participants, which I think is an aspect like inherent to virtually every product, because some topics may not seem sensitive at first glance. So for some, it might be sensitive to talk about finances, for others about their favorite hobby. People have different lived experiences, so we can't really predict what could be sensitive for them. And I think the mutually stress-inducing interactions can happen involving seemingly trivial topics. And let me share an example with you. So a fellow researcher once recounted an experience to me during a usability testing session for an online banking app, which initially seemed uneventful. One participant unexpectedly began crying upon viewing the app. And my peer later discovered that the app was distressing to the participant because it reminded them of their debts. So that's what I mean by saying that we never know what might be a sensitive or stressful topic to someone. Another reason why I think we should pay attention is that we might already be showing signs of neglecting self-care. Actually, when I read about these signs, I felt quite fine. So I was genuinely surprised to realize that I could identify with some of them. This made me think more about how much I actually monitor my own well-being. And just to clarify, this lack of self-care, at least according to an article in a Harvard Business Review, manifests itself in the following ways. It's self-neglect, over-managing yourself, self-sabotage, and excessive amounts of self-preservation. The third reason is that while being empathetic and compassionate isn't easy, it's not just nurses and social workers who suffer from compassion fatigue. UX researchers might actually also experience it. And I think it's important to recognize when we're being compassionate. To recognize when we're being compassionate and when we are already dealing with compassion fatigue, because I think we might not even be aware of it. So I think that's why it's also very important to monitor our own well-being. And the last, but definitely not least, I would like to emphasize that I think it shouldn't only be us UX researchers taking action for our own well-being. Ideally, well-being should be an integral part of every company's work culture. While individuals hold some responsibility, I think it's important to recognize that our work culture impacts all core elements of our well-being as defined here by Gallup. And more generally, I would argue that it's actually beneficial to expand the conversation about mental health, self-care to society at large. And I know that everything sounds great in theory, but let me share some real life examples. And I hope you'll feel comfortable sharing your own self-care ideas during or after my talk. It would be great if we could all learn from each other and make self-care simple and enjoyable. So so one of my earliest usability tests was with a colleague of mine who was using our product. By the way, testing with an internal team member can be a great way to build confidence. In my current company, we even conduct tests in English with our Czech-speaking colleagues to provide a safe space, for example, for designers who aren't comfortable with English to feel out English-led testing. So I was genuinely looking forward to this testing session with my colleague. I had taken to heart a lesson that had been repeatedly emphasized. Participants should leave interviews or testing sessions in an improved or similar mood as before. But in the end, it became an opportunity for my colleague to express all her frustrations about the product, which was then quite unfamiliar to me. By the end, she actually appeared to be in better spirits, which maybe indicated that I had applied this principle. However, post-testing, I felt a wave of distress as if I had mismanaged everything, and I questioned what I could have done differently. I received feedback on my mistakes, but back then I reached a point where I couldn't absorb it anymore. So I had lost perspective. I would say I was quite like consumed by a whirlwind of my own like catastrophic thoughts. So reflecting on this and other comparable situations, I found myself wondering about the state of mind we, UX researchers, enter and exit interviews with. While prioritizing the well-being of our research participants remains crucial, I've added to myself another sentence, the foil to it. Researchers should leave an interview in an improved or at the very least a similar mood as before. Therefore, I decided not only to discuss the significance of mental health and the emotional demands of UX research in general, but also to put appropriate measures into practice. And these are what I would like to share with you now. So first, I attempted, or I still attempt, to set more realistic expectations for myself. Because at times it feels like people expect a lot from me, but ultimately no one demands more from me than I demand from myself. So I ask myself, what criteria define a successful interview or usability session for me? Like, what needs to happen for me to say it went well? Because I think it's beneficial to recognize your mistakes because acknowledging them leads to learning. But it seems to me that practicing the act of affirming our strengths is way less common than fixating on our mistakes. That's why I believe that learning to acknowledge and celebrate my successes actually has proven healing. And in my view, it's challenging to make progress without a clear goal in mind, without knowing the destination. It is hard to know which route is best to take. So, for example, my personal objective is to always ensure the well-being of my research participants, even if it requires me to set aside some interview questions. So, reflecting on my initial story about the session with my colleague, my aim would be now to, of course, maintain politeness while upholding my personal boundaries. With that approach, I think I would feel more confident in asking, is today a good day to discuss this topic? Because it surely felt like a very bad day to discuss it. So I know now it would have been a valid option to end the session and resume it another time. In that situation, I only could think of things that I had failed to do during the session, which I think is maybe quite natural. But I believe we shouldn't narrow our focus to just what we may have been doing wrong. This thought pattern rarely, if ever, means that everything went downhill and the interview or the session was a total disaster. Subjective experience is all we have, and I actually believe it is directly influenced by the state of our mental health. That's why I think it's great if we have the opportunity to hear another perspective on how we did. And one way to do this is to get feedback, preferably from someone who is distanced from the thing, which is seemingly an issue. That's why in my current team, we offer each other feedback on everything. We've learned how to give constructive feedback. I think that's also not easy, and it's good to like educate ourselves. And it genuinely makes a significant difference in understanding what areas we can improve. Briefing and debriefing, or a strong start and finish. are, to me, necessary parts of every interview or testing session. We want to establish a trusting relationship with the participants, and their well-being should be more important to us than any research objective, I believe, I would argue. But I see briefing and debriefing as important for researchers as well. I think that the mood we set at the beginning will inevitably be the same throughout the interview. I witness myself that our bad moods are contagious, and giving ourselves a moment of peace before an interview is, to me, self-care 101. Not having any buffer time to recover before, after, or between interviews sounds to me more like self-neglect. So during my breaks, I usually have coffee, I pet my cat, I already mentioned, or I just quite often I actually stare into space, which hopefully counts as self-care as well. And I see the way in which the interview ends to be of mutual importance. I actually find it very beneficial to debrief with the others present as observers during the session or during the interview, and to glean some final insights. Finally, it is crucial to do a debriefing with myself, reflecting internally or just jotting down notes where I summarize what went well and what could have gone a little better. Concluding the interview overall, and if something clashed with my expectations during the interview or the session, I'll recap it during the debrief. And taking this final step actually helps me a lot not to overthink it. So that's why I would recommend it to you. Last but not least is embracing mishaps as learning opportunities, particularly within the context of humanizing UX researchers, not in the context of focusing on mistakes exclusively. Because it can happen that the mistakes are not just perceived, but real. When a problem or awkward situation arises during the interview, it has happened to all of us, or at least that's what I tell myself. You can let me know if it happened to you. I would like to share some instances of when I try to apply this principle. So I, for example, accidentally asked the participant twice in a row how they're doing, and they answered the same way twice, word for word. So that felt a bit awkward. Or even on the third attempt, I failed to say another participant's name correctly. I feel like that's also not rare, or at least not rare to me, unfortunately. Or during a remote interview, I first could not join the meeting, then could not share my screen, and finally the recording would not start. So back then, and that definitely felt to me like a total disaster. I see it very differently nowadays. And what helped me to deal with these situations was realizing that I should not enter the interviews with the intention of impressing the participants. I'm not the expert in that situation, they are. And I like to believe that humans are empathetic creatures and have plenty of their own concerns, certainly enough to forgive my mistakes or our mistakes. And from my experience, what we are more likely to remember is when something trips us up and we manage to overcome the obstacle, whatever it might be. I think I actually humanize myself by acknowledging my mistakes, and I feel like it makes it easier to sympathize with me. And in addition, this might sound a bit, poetic, but I think that every stumble is an opportunity to try something new. So what I also like to do and find quite enriching is to try to distance myself from the situation and just observe how I solve the problem. And as I have found, I think it's okay to squeeze under some obstacles when they can't be jumped over. So let me kind of conclude this talk by saying that being a UX researcher is an emotionally demanding job. In our field, it's necessary to prioritize self-care in order to better care for others. Many methods, techniques, and activities can help us to improve our mental well-being. And what we can start doing today is think about what a successful interview or session actually means to us, what must happen in order for us to be satisfied with our work, and then measure it based on those criteria. We can ask for feedback if possible, and not be alone with our subjective experience, which is not always on our side. I actually think that we all have an inner saboteur. Oh, that's how I like to call it. We can take time for ourselves and take care of ourselves before the interview to ensure better outcomes. And this might be a bit controversial, but I think we don't actually have to point out our mistakes to anyone. I think it's completely fine to keep them to ourselves. And when things don't go smoothly, I think it's okay. We have found an opportunity to learn something new about ourselves. Unfortunately, sometimes we cannot learn anything from it, and we are just angry at ourselves, and we will for sure subsequently do better. And that's fine too, because I like to say that we are people first, and UX researchers just somewhere after that. And as I conclude, I definitely invite you to get in touch if you have any questions or wish to discuss further. I hope you do. Thank you very much for joining me. And yeah, I believe now it's time for your questions if you have any.